Can you tell us a little bit about what drives gendered violence?
Structural factors, social attitudes are really critical to this. Some of the things around like the sort of embedded way in which gender inequality works in our society and the way in which patriarchal privilege tends to kind of reproduce itself means that we've really got to look at important rights that women have in terms of, access to a secure income, access to, legal advice and support, should that be the case, etc. And at the community level, I think that there is a real need for, large influential social institutions to be standing up and sort of talking about their attitudes and beliefs and what's acceptable and what needs to change. Because I think unless we see that happening regularly, then we're not going to get the kind of multiple changes that we need.
Yeah. I mean, especially when, they're big employers, they have a big responsibility in setting cultural norms.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things is we do really need that top-down cultural change in workplaces to make sure that it filters through the organisation. So there's not just individuals in certain parts of a large workplace that are very supportive and great to work in, and then other places are terrible and awful in other parts of the organisation. So you really need that leadership and that leadership to stay in place in terms of that cultural shift, that it's not a kind of, we do a week of campaigning and advertising, etc., and then we forget for the other 51 weeks of the year as well.
There are a lot of broad factors, right? And we have to look at it holistically and not in a silo from one another. And that's a really big body of work to get done. It's a big job. Are you seeing signs of improvement?
I think we are seeing that, and I think we're also starting to see that or recognise much more that it's not a one-size-fits-all response. So there are some broad one-size-fits-all, like it'd be great to have a much more, not to have a gender pay gap, for example, and for people to have access to leave, etc., when they need it. So those broad-based things, absolutely, but the kind of supports that you might need if you're a person who identifies as part of the queer community or LGBTIQ+, then the sorts of supports you might want to have in place in your workplace will obviously be affected by the culture as well in terms of how well and how supportive they are of folks in that, from that community to start with. So I think all of those kind of things matter as well. Or for Aboriginal women and children who are disproportionately affected, we really need place-based solutions, etc., and not necessarily the ones that have always been used by the kind of mainstream society.
Yeah, that intersectionality is so important. Are there policy initiatives that you think could really make a change culturally around gendered violence?
I think one of the things is that we've seen, the law and social policy used to kind of bring about social change in domestic violence and sexual violence. And I think, one of those is the latest work around coercive control, be it advertising campaigns or promotions, as well as bringing it into legislation. So it's going to be quite hard to police and put into implementing that legislation. But what it does is it lifts up the issue so that people start to see that it's more than just physical violence and that these kinds of behaviours have really early kind of seeds that people can see and early red flags. So I think those kind of things have made a difference.
So on a national level, there's now a positive duty on employers to actually prevent sexual harassment from occurring in the workplace. And if they don't take proper steps to ensure that that's not occurring under their watch, they can actually be held accountable for sexual harassment as well.
I think that's a really powerful step. And one of those things we were talking before about a really powerful statement of that shift in community attitudes, that this is something you actually need to actively prevent, not respond to once these things have occurred. So I think that's an incredibly powerful response. Unions in WA have had some important initiatives throughout this time as well. And the successes that go to preventing and responding more effectively to gendered violence in the workplace. Can you talk a little bit more about those successes and the things that you've been able to do?
What we know is that, gendered violence in the workplace at its core is a health and safety issue. So we've done some really great work pushing through some new codes of practice, some around psychosocial hazards, but also about violence and aggression in the workplace. And what's great about that particular code of practice is that it does talk about how do you set up prevention plans, what sort of training and education is needed to ensure that everybody is across sexual harassment in the workplace and what can be done about it. So that's a really great code of practice that people can look to for information to tackle it. Unions can organize workers, help them to build unity and strength to push back on employers. And that's around anything from wages to gendered violence, right? Unionizing is the best way to tackle any issue in the workplace. But, campaigning alongside with workers to ensure that employers are doing and fulfilling their obligations under the Health and Safety Act to provide and maintain a healthy and safe working environment. Absolutely. I think there's so much policy change. I think you had mentioned it before, when we've got leaders, both in the state and nationally, that are standing up against this and supporting policy initiatives, that can really drive a cultural change from the top down. We'd like to see legislative amendments that reduce the use of non-disclosure agreements for sexual harassment in the workplace. Another change to the Equal Opportunity Act that we've been pushing for is to ensure that women can't be discriminated against for experiencing family and domestic violence. We've had examples where women are actually let go from the workplace because there has been a restraining order, against their partners, which means that they can't be in the same workplace. So we definitely want to see those protections for women, and hopefully we'll make that change within the Equal Opportunity Act.
I think that'll be great, because what we see a lot of the time is women who are experiencing DV are often employed, as we talked about, in the workplace, but often the amount of jobs that they, are going through is a lot more than for people who aren't experiencing family and domestic violence. So, they may have 5 jobs in 2 years, which is not helpful, doesn't help you move on, not good for income security.
Yeah, it really does contribute to that gender pay gap in the long run, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.